On the migrant crisis in Europe, we are joined in Berlin by Mr. Günter Seufert, who is a senior fellow from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Also in Berlin, we're also joined by Dr. Angeliki Dimitriadi, who is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Meanwhile, joining us from Brussels, we're having Dr. Theresa Fallon, senior associate at the European Institute for Asian Studies. Welcome to all of you. First of all, about the issue of migrants, we've seen different German leaders seem to have different interpretations of what's the next step. For example, the president was talking about might be setting a limit, but of course, Chancellor Merkel, she's been talking about addressing the root cause. So, Mr. Seufert, what do you make of these apparent differences in opinions?
No, I think first of all, this difference in opinion mirrors the political debate in Germany. And obviously, the President of State told that, or said that it is morally also justifiable to think about limitation and stricter border control, because in Germany, the prevalent opinion is still that we should continue with an open border policy as Angela Merkel is doing it, but her position is under threat and under extreme pressure.
Yes, indeed. Ms. Dimitriadi, you probably have also a very close grasp of what exactly is going on right now in Germany. Of course, the earlier enthusiasm of helping the migrants have already been replaced by some concerns with the huge influx of them. What do you make of the realities? Where do you think the policy might be going?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The debate here in Germany is divided, but there is a growing realization that there has to be a reduction in the flows. There is a reduction in the flows nonetheless. In January of 2016, Germany only had about 2,000 people crossing its borders per day instead of 10,000 at its peak in the summer. It still sounds like a huge number, but it's a significant reduction. But the fact remains that Chancellor Merkel's policy, to me, seems to be the only feasible solution right now, a coherent, united European front in parallel working with Turkey.
Is a united European front possible, Ms. Fallon?
Well, that's a very good question. The head of the Commission, President Juncker, has said that the decisions have been made. It's the question of implementation. Many member states don't want to take the refugees. We've only seen about 300 actually resettled. So out of the thousands who have come to Europe, millions, tens of thousands, only 300 have been settled. So there's a big problem with implementation in various member states. We see today Denmark's having a debate on whether they will take the valuables of the immigrants to help pay for their resettlement, and they're saying this in a way to discourage more immigrants from going to their country. So there's not really, ideally we want a united European front on this, but each member state is kind of picking and choosing to make themselves seem less attractive, and as we see, more walls are going up rather than coming down.
I remember the German president, Mr. Gauck, at the Davos meeting, he was making a speech in which he specifically said one thing, that is about the European value system. He said, if that's the value system that can now endure challenges, then that is not the value system that we are having. That's an interesting remark there. Mr. Seufert, I understand a lot of debates now, it's really not just about the migrants itself. It's about what Europe stands for and how much can Europe endure in order to maintain its value system, and what will be the responsibilities of every individual country inside Europe in shouldering those value systems. Mr. Seufert.
Yes, I think that's really a great question, because what is meant by European value systems is a lot of different things or different subjects. One is naturally humanitarian values, values of freedom and democracy, of free movement of people, but particularly in the refugee crisis, of the upholding of the Geneva Convention of 1959 that grants really asylum to political refugees. But another part of the European value system is naturally Europe itself, its ability to act together, its very existence, and its upholding of liberal democracy in the single European member states. And to say today we see, due to the refugee crisis and due to the rejection of large parts of the populations to the influx of more refugees, that these liberal values inside the European Union itself are threatened. And therefore it's not easy to say we are protecting the European value system.
Ms. Fallon, is this it? Is this going to be the critical moment to examine where Europe is and whether there is something called the European Union, whether there is a common value system, and whether countries can work together on one critical issue? Is this it?
Well, as you've pointed out, it is a crisis right now, and Europe has been dashing from crisis to crisis since the financial crisis, the euro crisis way back 2007, 2008, then Russia, Ukraine, now we have the refugee crisis. So the system is getting exhausted, and it's hard for them to make long-term strategic thinking when they're dashing from crisis to crisis and managing these issues. You point out that one of the pillars of the Schengen, the free movement of peoples, is really being put to the test. But I think managing borders is really key for any country, and the EU has Frontex, so it's an EU organized group, but member states aren't sending the ships that they promised. So the key regions like Greece and Italy are really suffering because they're on the key question, I think, is money. Who's going to pay for all of this? And how are we going to share the burden? So I've seen a suggestion by Germany, which I thought was actually quite a good one, to have a petrol tax, because we have such low oil prices right now, and that could be shared by everybody across the EU. So people haven't really addressed who's going to pay and how are they going to pay for it. So that at least is on the table.
Well, you said it is pretty exhausting for the EU to come up with all the solutions, one crisis after the other. But Ms. Dimitriadi, many would argue the other way around, that when you have crisis, is exactly the time that you shore up your value system. You have your value system to test, and therefore getting ever stronger. So do you think this is the critical time? What do you think might be the end result that we can take a look back at how strong the EU is, how strong the European common value is?
Well, I think that as things are right now, we are seeing very different visions of Europe and how each member state perceives itself in this European Union. If we would manage to get out of this crisis still united, I think it would be an opportunity for us to actually move towards a stronger cooperation and develop trust between the member states, which in my view is what is fundamentally lacking right now. And you see this especially in the management of the refugees. But at the same time, it's a critical situation because, as you know, nationalist views are showing up across various member states. Member states are increasingly closing their borders and trying to make themselves less attractive to the refugees. So there is an inherent imbalance in the system and a contradiction. On the one hand, we want to uphold the liberal norms that we are supposed to be embedded in our national systems, and at the same time, insecurity is rising up. And it's forcing people to take reactive rather than proactive measures.
Right.
So it's very unclear how the Union will come out of this in the end.
Mr. Seufert, we talk about the value system, we talk about the European Union, but now let's talk about some pragmatic issues. Border control, to what extent? Earlier, Ms. Fallon also mentioned about the oil tax, for example. Will those tricks and also ways of doing things eventually help the European Union coming out of this crisis and find a solution?
I don't think so. I think it is totally out of possibility to increase taxes due to the refugee influx, because it will make it much more unpopular to accept refugees. We know that already in Germany at that time on a very moderate level, but in other countries we have a strong resistance against any further influx of refugees. And I personally think, and I think it's true, that Germany is almost completely isolated inside the European Union, because it's only Germany that today officially upholds its open border policy. All the other countries have closed their borders down or have openly declared that they are not going to accept more refugees. We see a deep divide between Western Europe, the old members of the Eurozone and of the European Union, and the new members which joined the European after the so-called Eastern enlargement. And I see no possibility for developing a joint policy. And therefore, I think states are naturally actual unilateral or at least bilateral. And therefore, on the long run, I see we are going to close the borders. We are going to limit the influx of refugees to protect the Union, to protect our own system.
I see.
This is unfortunately what I am seeing.
There are three set of things. One, of course, is a European value system. And how will this crisis experience test this value system? The other thing is, what if absorb these migrants? What kind of real challenges would they pose on the European countries? And the latter is, what can the European countries do together in order to overcome some of these challenges posed by the incoming migrants as a result of observing the European value system? So these three kinds of things, usually people mix it up. But do you think, Ms. Dimitriadi, that these three different groups of issues should be mixed up? Or actually they have to be separated so that to sort one thing out of all of the entangled issues? Ms. Dimitriadi.
Well, I think you can't completely separate them, because when people come into a country, they have to assimilate to its culture, its norms, and its legal system. So there are certain expectations that are natural. Can Europe assimilate the number of refugees that are currently coming? It's a good question. In my view, I think it can, but it can only if every single member participates in that process. And if assimilation acknowledges that it has to be, in a way, a two-way street. They have to accept a lot of our legal framework, our culture and our norms, but we also have to accept that in some things we will always be different. And that's fine, that's good. That still makes them productive members of society, and we can benefit from this interaction. But this can only take place, like I said, if every single member participates, because what we're seeing right now is that the discussion around assimilation is still limited to the few member states that had to take the first influx of the refugees. So Sweden, Germany, Austria, Denmark to a lesser extent.
Yes.
You're not hearing this discussion taking